So returning, I mentioned at the start of the show, we have a guest joining us. We have Hans von Spakovsky. He is with the Heritage Foundation. He is at Heritage Foundation, a election law reform initiative. He's a senior legal fellow. He is just a fount of knowledge about election law. And I want to have him on today to talk about the fact Democrats in this country, or leftists in this country, policymakers are arguing that given the threat of coronavirus, we shouldn't have in-person elections in the fall, that the country should turn entirely to mail-in ballot, or at least as far as possible, turn us to mail-in ballot. Why I want to talk to Hans is because I want to ask him to tell us what is so bad about mail-in ballots. Why are people concerned that mail-in ballots may lead to a fraudulent election? So first, Hans von Spakovsky, hello and welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. Look, the basic problem is that absentee ballots depend on the U.S. Postal Service. And second, they are voted out of sight and out of the supervision of election officials. So that means you have no way of preventing the kind of pressure that can be placed on voters when candidates and campaign organizations and others can go to their homes and pressure them to fill out ballots a particular way, or in fact, complete their ballots for them. And I can cite you many cases of things like that happening, including in Texas. There are prosecutions going on of what are called politiqueras, who are folks who are paid to go to people's homes and collect their absentee ballots. And oftentimes, like I said, they fill out the ballots for them. The Wisconsin election, which they just had, they found boxes of absentee ballots after the election that had not been delivered by the U.S. Postal Service. And just one other fact, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission files reports with Congress every 2 years about federal elections. They collect data from the states. In the 2016 election, Debbie, you recall, there was a 2.9 million vote difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Well, according to the EAC, in that same election, 6.5 million absentee or mail-in ballots. They don't know what happened to them. They're listed as unknown. They don't know what happened to the ballots after they handed them off to the Postal Service. And many of them also were misdirected. They went to the wrong address, or the U.S. Postal Service sent them back saying, there is no such registered voter at this address.
Okay, so first of all, let's just break these problems down very quickly. We have to, if you go to mail-in ballots, you must rely on the Postal Service, which is usually, right, sadly, the butt of many jokes about just not reliable. And so, but let's assume you had a perfect Postal Service, meaning that they actually delivered all the ballots to the correct address, and then they took the ballots from the mail and delivered them back to the proper authority. Right. Let's assume they're perfect, which they are not even close. But I want to get at is how this can be used if an entity were determined to cheat. They use the expression ballot harvesting. I know you're alluding to it, but can you describe again what ballot harvesting means?
In some states, they allow ballot or vote harvesting. That means that anyone can show up at your house to pick up your ballot to deliver it. So that means that candidates, campaign organizations, party activists, and political guns for hire can show up at your house to collect your ballot. And if you want to see what that means, all you have to do is look at the 2018 congressional race in North Carolina, NC9. It was the only contested race in the country. The election was overturned. Why? Because one of the candidates, in this case the Republican candidate, had hired a well-known political consultant there who sent his staff people to people's homes to collect their ballots. And the evidence showed that they forged signatures, altered ballots, and in some cases simply filled it out to make sure they got votes the way they wanted them. And this guy had previously worked for numerous Democratic candidates, too.
You know, there is an article, in fact, it's up at our website, americacanwetalk.org, on the homepage under shows, drop-down list of links. The title should scare you. 15 election results that were thrown out because of fraudulent mail-in ballots. It's a Daily Signal article. So this is not once in a while or one time ever in American history. 15 times actual results had to be thrown out because of fraudulent mail-in ballots. And so I should say it's a kind of a disaster waiting to happen. And then the other instance you just mentioned, that there were 28 million mail-in ballots that went missing. That was in the, which, do you know about that one? Is that one?
Yeah, 10 years worth of elections, 2012 through 2018. So that's a lot of missing ballots or misdirected ballots, and that shows the uncertainty of the absentee ballot process and the use of the mails.
It is just an astonishing thing. I mean, I was mentioning before we got started today, I know of conservatives who are commenting on social media, well, maybe given the coronavirus, this is what we have to do this time. We have to go to mail-in ballots. They couldn't really be that big of a problem. This is America. This is 2020. We can keep track of mail-in ballots. But the inability, as you say, the inability of election clerks to be there to help you if you do something that is confused and inaccurate, the loss of things in the mail, the potential for fraud, overwhelming potential for fraud. I mean, it should be a very last resort instead of what some are trying to drive it to be, the primary one, right?
Right. No, you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing I mentioned to you, I saw an article that was talking about in Wisconsin, there was quite a controversy because the state of Wisconsin ended up having, in the middle of this pandemic, having in-person voting. Many people claiming that it was going to be bad. Yeah. The headline said, one article, which actually was USA Today, so it wasn't a liberal source at all, said for all the bad headlines, there's really no evidence that coronavirus spread as a result of this in-person election. They can say, well, so-and-so went there and got the virus, but it was not in big numbers. They didn't have an outbreak. So there's really not that example either to point to. So to wrap it up,
they had turnout. The turnout in the Wisconsin primary with in-person voting was 34%. In 2008, when there was a heavily contested race between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, it was 35%. So almost identical. And 1.5 million people voted.
Yeah, it seems like I'm going to talk about after we're finished talking today about the many ways in which this crisis is being exploited. But the idea of going to a known dangerous version of voting and which allows for ballot harvesting, which seems to be a problem. Okay, one last thing. I know we're about out of our time here, but Hans, in California, there were problems with the mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting in the midterm elections in 2018, right? Weren't there some seats that seemed to be?
There were a quarter million ballots absentee ballots suddenly came in after the election, after election day, because California had legalized vote harvesting 2 years ago. And it changed the outcome of, I think, 7 or 8 congressional races, changing the outcomes based on the votes that had previously come in by election day.
And all of those, if I'm recalling the data correctly, all of those went from a Republican victory to a Democrat victory. Is that right? I'm pretty sure.
That's correct. Yeah.
Simply amazing. Hans von Spakovsky, first of all, thank you. I know you have a busy schedule. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today. And I love that you are an election law expert and you can help people understand this is not being offered because it's just a way to help people out. This is another scheme, another method to bring about dishonest results in elections, and Americans deserve better. So thank you, Hans von Spakovsky.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Great to see you, sir. Okay, folks, I have to tell you, we need to keep focusing on this because there is more and more talk about the effort of the left, even in this very next thing we're going to be watching, this very next bill that's going to be coming out of Congress to do further coronavirus rescue aid. Nancy Pelosi is very strongly pushing for, saying it's just time we have to do it. We are going to have to go ahead and work with and get around to having mail-in ballots for our fall election. This is one of the many reasons the left tries to perpetuate this crisis or keep America in a crisis mode, because they can get things like this into legislation. I will remind you, back when this whole crisis first started, this whole dealing with coronavirus, and you had the very first bill coming out of Congress, very first bill that Nancy Pelosi got on top of, and she went through all the ways they put in their aid package for coronavirus, all sorts of things that had nothing to do with helping coronavirus victims, nothing to do with trying to stop the spread, everything to do of exploiting this crisis to try to put in place manipulative practices the left uses to cheat in elections. This was the very first coronavirus spending bill that the House drafted, that Nancy Pelosi and her team came up with. It included mandating that states all go along with early voting, mandating voting by mail, legalization of California-style ballot harvesting, same-day registration. If you want to make a list of all the ways in which people can cheat in elections, Nancy Pelosi tried to mandate those across the country by putting them in the very first coronavirus bailout package. Fortunately, there were some people paying attention, and she didn't get too far in that one. But I'm telling you, folks, this we must keep our eyes on, and we must insist our legislators do not permit this kind of crazy. And again, I want to go back and mention this story I talked about out of Wisconsin, where they had the primary recently, even during the coronavirus challenge America is facing, and a lot of leftists were trying to force that to go to all either online or mail voting, and the state kept the in-person voting that they always do, which was in accord with their state law. And there were all sorts of scary headlines. You can read, if you are trying to scare people, there were headlines that said, 9 people contract coronavirus because of in-person voting in Wisconsin, spread of coronavirus in Wisconsin due to this in-person voting. And USA Today, of all amazing sources, not usually a friend to conservatism, but they pointed out, they in fact were calling those articles fake. They were doing a fact check and saying these are not true. There's absolutely no evidence that in-person voting did in fact lead to some massive outbreak of coronavirus in Wisconsin. We do not have to go there. We cannot get pushed around by the left to going toward mail-in ballots. We can vote in person in the fall, and we ought to not even be thinking that by November of this year, we're still going to be in this crisis level problem.